afternoon. I'm Anton Raymond at your service. I want to thank you for stopping to see me and my rather tall marker that stands behind me. So thank you for stopping today. I'd like to share a little of my life story with you. I was born on April 15th, 1837 in Gulbickelheim, Germany. And we were one of many German immigrant families who came to America in the mid-19th century. I was just 16 when we landed in New Orleans in 1853. And after a short stop in Galena, Illinois, we moved on to Wheeling later that fall. At 17, I started a 4-year apprenticeship with Franklin Brewery, and it was located at 15th and Market Street and owned by my uncle, Peter Paul Beck, who had taken my father on as a partner. Now, as part of that apprenticeship, I spent some time learning the trade in the breweries of Cincinnati and St. Louis, which, like Wheeling, had sizable German populations. I returned to Wheeling, and in 1862, I married Uncle Peter's daughter, Thusnelda. And we all called her Nellie. I guess you can probably figure out why. Sadly, Uncle Peter died just 9 days after we were married, and I formed a partnership with his widow, Elizabeth, and assumed the major role in running the operation. I shortly bought out Elizabeth's share of the business, and in 1865 I moved the brewery to the east end of 17th Street across the creek in the Manchester section. Now, by the late 1800s, we were producing 100,000 barrels a year, and we're the largest brewery in the state of West Virginia. By 1904, our production had reached 150,000 barrels a year, and we had bottling operations across 14 locations in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Now, I was also involved with the Wheeling and in 1873, that was a narrow, strong line. But my financing helped to change it first to steam and then later to electricity. That railroad was soon to become important to me for a different reason. You see, in 1880, I bought the former Hornbrook estate and established a popular amusement park. Visitors could board the trolley in downtown Wheeling and ride it all the way to the park, getting off right at the entrance. And then after an afternoon of enjoying the fresh air and some of the rides and so forth, could enjoy a pint or two of what else? Raymond beer, which was the only beer sold in that park, and I'm sure my competitor, Henry Schmalbach, was not pleased with that. Now, in West Virginia, the Yost Act outlawed the production and sale of alcohol 6 years before it was banned nationally. So Prohibition put an end to beer manufacturing, and neither Henry or I were happy with that turn of events. We closed the brewery on June 1st, 1914, and converted it to a meatpacking operation. The park soon closed and sat idle for many years before eventually being sold and became the property of the city of Wheeling. And Wheeling Park was opened on Memorial Day in 1925. Henry and I weren't rivals in all areas, however. We both helped found the German Bank of Wheeling, which I'm pleased to say still exists today as West Banco. We also both supported the local German singing societies, and I played the flute quite well, if I do say so myself. Now, Nellie and I were blessed with 10 children. Sadly, 6 died in early childhood, but our daughters Annie and Nettie and sons Paul and Lawrence survived to adulthood. Paul was involved with the meatpacking operation and running the railroad, And Lawrence was an attorney by trade who became very well known for his breeding of Ayrshire cattle and production of certified milk. Now, in 1891, we built a beautiful mansion at the corner of 15th and O Street, and it was the talk of the town, and many of the citizens of our fair city visited the mansion during construction. Of course, they were uninvited. Now, that mansion's since been demolished, and only the former carriage house still stands. You might be familiar with that building. It's across Oak Street from the First State Capitol building, and was once Payton's Pharmacy. And you can still see decorative brewing icons up on the facade of the building in brick. Now, we also had a farm and a summer residence in Hardy County. And after Lawrence died from scarlet fever at the young age of 33, we donated the farm to West Virginia University, and it's still being used for livestock, poultry, and crop research. But business wasn't my only interest. I made sure that my will made provisions for Wheeling charities, including the Home of Good Shepherd, Ohio Valley General Hospital, and the Children's Home. But probably my favorite charity was Altenheim. As I looked around Wheeling, I became aware that there were many immigrant women who had come to this country as domestic servants. Many never married and spent their lives working in the homes of Wheeling's wealthy. My concern was for their fate when they could no longer do the physical labor they had been brought here to perform. Many didn't have the means or desire to return to their native countries. So what was to become of them? And therefore I established Altenheim, the home for aged and friendless women. In 1891, I purchased the former Mount Bellevue Hotel, which was an out-pike hotel used by many of Wheeling's wealthy as a summer residence. After extensive remodeling, it became a 40-room residence, which was suitable for the needs of those women. To ensure the project's success, I fully funded the first year's operation and also established a trust to provide for the long-term maintenance of the facility. Many years after my death, it moved to its current location at 1387 National Road, and while the needs have changed and so has the residents, I'm pleased to say that it served its original purpose for many years. I died on January 11, 1924 at the age of 86 after a long and productive life. I was named to the Wheeling Hall of Fame in 2008, not for my business expertise, but rather for my philanthropy. I want to thank you for stopping and sharing my story today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit. And as Ben Franklin once reportedly said, please remember, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. Thank you.
Schmolbach, obviously, and no matter what Mr. Raymond may have said, he exaggerated a little bit probably. We'll start off with the obvious point that my monument is bigger than his. Now his may be taller, but mine's bigger, so that's just one of our little healthy sort of business and other rivalries that was a major part of my career and his career here in Wheeling. But I'm Henry Schmolbach. I was born in 1844. I came here with my family at the age of 8. We were immigrants, German immigrants. And I sort of rose from sort of very, very humble roots to become one of Wheeling's most rich and famous people. Famous to some, infamous to others for reasons I will get to in a little bit. You can't believe all the stories about me, but a lot of them are true. I started working quite young. I had to start working at the age of 10 for my uncle George Teller, who unloaded and loaded packing boats along the Ohio River that were going north and south. I worked with a lot of Irish and German immigrants who I learned a lot from, how to work hard, how to sort of be entrepreneurial. I also learned a lot of great jokes and words that as a young boy I probably shouldn't have learned, but that was okay. And in their honor for what they taught me, I actually had erected in 1900 a marker down by what's now known as Heritage Port that honors the people who had worked in that area. So by the age of 17, I was wanting to be someone that worked for myself, and I started in the wholesale grocery business. In 3 years, it had been so profitable that I sold it for a high profit and got into the wholesale liquor trade, which at a time when Wheeling was a bustling commercial center and now the state capital of the new state of West Virginia, there were a lot of people coming here and I thought that was a good business opportunity. Within less than 10 years, I had earned enough money that I could buy a fancy mansion along what was known as Millionaires Row in the 2300 block of Chaplin Street at 2311. Lived there with my two elderly sisters who never married, and I took care of them until they passed away. If you go there today, it's still there, and on the glass on the front of the building and on the iron gate, you will see my initials, H and S. And I wanted to overlay the two of them because I got the ingenious idea that if you put the H over the S, it looks like a dollar sign. And I used that as my trademark for the rest of my career as much as I possibly could. People really didn't like that I was flaunting my wealth so much. But I was getting involved in a variety of things, and I thought it was probably smart to get into producing my own beer. So in the early 1880s, I bought the failing Nail City Brewing Company at the top of 33rd Street in South Wheeling and made it into the Schmolbach Brewing Company, which was my most famous business endeavor. It became so large, we built about 8 or 9 buildings. We had an ice house cut into the hillside. We made beers such as this for thirsty working class people throughout the city of Wheeling. And we became a major distributor throughout the state. At a high point, we were producing 200,000 barrels of beer a year, tops in the state of West Virginia. Now, sometimes Mr. Raymond would beat us, then we would beat him the following year, but we were 1 and 2 throughout my entire career until 1914 when the state went dry because of the Yost Law. Now, I was becoming so wealthy that I decided I wanted to get involved in other business entities. So I got involved in bridge building companies, the railroad, the first telephone exchange here in Wheeling. I also was a main investor and manager of the German Bank of Wheeling, which I hear now is referred to as West Banco. I was a director on the Top Mill, which was a prominent mill in North Wheeling near Warwood that later became part of Wheeling Steel. And I was so successful that in 1905, at the cost of $150,000, I wanted to have the tallest building in the state of West Virginia. And so in downtown Wheeling, we built ourselves a new modern office complex. Took 2 years to finish, but it was for many years the tallest building in the state. After I died, it became used as a headquarters for, I heard, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel for many years, and is now, as we speak, being retrofitted for other purposes. Now, me and Mr. Raymond had a nice little rivalry going in business. He had this ingenious idea that he wanted to buy land east of town here, the Hornbrook property, which he turned into an amusement park. It's now known as Wheeling Park, and at the time his idea was to provide entertainment and, of course, sell only Raymond beer. I didn't want to be outdone. I did think that was a smart move on his part, and so I wanted to build a park that was closer to the working class population of Wheeling and South Wheeling. We built it on top of the hill there in Mozart. We had to find a way to get people there, and we had this ingenious idea to build a rail sort of car that would take you to the top, an incline. Many people just came to ride the incline more than anything else, but at the top, 600 feet high, you had a modern dance pavilion that could have 5,000 people at any time, a bicycle racetrack, we had a bowling alley, among many, many, many other things. At one point, I wanted to have a zoo. I thought that would have been nice, but unfortunately, one of our first exhibits was a caged bear that one night a group of patrons who got a little too drunk killed it, which killed a great business opportunity I thought we could have had there. Now, people criticized me a lot. I gave back in many philanthropic causes throughout Wheeling, but a lot of people blamed me and Mr. Raymond for controlling the politics in Wheeling. I don't see how we could do that. Mr. Raymond was a prominent Democratic figure in the state. I was a prominent member of the Republican Party. And people at the time, they criticized the fact that they voted in Wheeling in saloons and bars. Now, most saloons either were saloons that sold Raymond's beer or Schmollbach's beer, and so I don't really understand why people thought there was some sort of corruption going on there. But nonetheless, the paper would often claim around the turn of the 20th century that Henry Schmollbach was the reason the city was corrupt and had all these issues going on. They called it Schmollbachism. I never found out what they really meant by that, but they would spread all kinds of rumors about it. I think they didn't like the fact that I liked to gamble. I liked to drink in saloons. I liked to race horses, which was not something that was very popular among sort of the wealthy people here in Wheeling. And people also raised a lot of questions, but I remained a bachelor until my late 60s. And people really wondered why that was the case. I luckily, through some influence, was able to keep my name out of the press in the early 1890s when I was found in a certain house in East Wheeling. But we won't talk about that too much. People say all kinds of crazy things. You don't know. You can't believe half of it. But I did get in trouble in 1878 when I got into an altercation with a man when I was at Frank Walter's Roadhouse. He was a friend of mine. It was up the National Road here near about where the Vance Memorial Presbyterian Church is located. A man named Hamilton Forsyth came in and started arguing with me. He started sort of saying all kinds of things, and I just told him to get lost, get out of here. Well, on his way out, he stole my 2-horse buggy.
Oh.
Horse thievery is the worst crime you could commit at that time in my book, and so I went after him to get my property back. I'm not going to let this guy get away with this. So we caught up, actually not too far away from here, and we got into a fist fight. I, of course, won that fight, as you can probably imagine, but at one point Ham fell down, hit his head on the ground. I thought he was fine, but the next day the papers reported he had died. So this became a huge scandal. Now Henry's killed somebody. Now, of course, you have to be proven guilty by a jury of your peers, and my peers found me not guilty, said it was self-defense. Of course it was. But that followed me the rest of my career. Well, by 1912, I decided it was probably time for me to finally settle down. And so I married my wife, Eva Pauline Berkey, who was 21 years younger than me. That raised some eyebrows at the time. I had also decided it was probably time to retire because this was at the time the state voters had voted to go dry. I didn't really want to try to deal with the aftermath of that, so I figured it was probably good to just retire. I would often come into town to go to the German bank and check on some of the other boards that I was on. But we bought a big fancy mansion for ourselves east of town, out at Roney's Point, if you have ever been in that area. It was remote. We had a large area for me to ride horses and let them roam freely. My wife had a big expanse of glass canopy that enclosed a lot of plants and other sort of wildlife as well. We were having a great time, but by 1915 I was starting to get sick, and I died at the age of 71, only getting to enjoy the mansion for a very short period of time. Now, when I died, people had asked me, what did he want listed on his death certificate? And I told them before I died, I wanted it to say that I, in my occupation, was a capitalist. That I had made wealth, and that was what I wanted to be known for. So I hope you will come to appreciate a lot of the contributions I made in the city of Wheeling. You don't believe every story you're told about me, but I was one of the many sort of important people that made Wheeling what it was. And last point, as you will notice, my marker is bigger than Mr. Raymond's. So I won in the end as well. Thank you all. Appreciate your time.
My name is Ruth Jacobs Woods. This is my family's mausoleum. I'm here with my sons, Archibald and George. I lived to be 96 years old. I survived all of my children. And you know what? I don't remember a whole lot from the last 15 years of my life. I don't know, maybe nothing happened, but I do remember the past. And let me tell you about that. Well, I was born in 1823 in Indiana, and my father, who was a doctor, brought us here from there. Well, I met John Woods, and John and I were married. I was 20, and he was 36, and our firstborn son we named Archibald, after his grandfather. Now, Archibald Woods was one of the very first settlers in this area. Archibald was quite a man. You see, when he was 16 years old, he joined the Revolutionary War and fought valiantly until 1781, when he was injured at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, 2 years later, he and his brothers, Robert and Andrew, traveled here to the valley to claim land. Well, Archibald settled in what we now know as Woodsdale. In 1787, he built himself a house there in an orchard on a road called Homestead Lane. Now, I didn't know Archibald all that well. He passed away in 1846, so maybe 3 years, but all the stories that we heard about him. So let me tell you, when he was a young man, he was a delegate to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he was one of two to sign and vote for the U.S. Constitution. The other delegate was Ebenezer Zane, who was, of course, the founder of the city of Wheeling. Now, I remember Archibald used to say, "Farmers today, statesmen tomorrow, soldiers always." But this wasn't his only land holding. He had other land holdings. He had 60,000 acres in Ohio. Are you familiar with Woodsfield? That was Archibald. Now, he was also a very active proponent of the National Road, and that National Road cut right through his property in 1818. That brought so many travelers here that Wheeling was called the Gateway to the West. So, now let me brag about my children a little bit. Of course, Archibald, firstborn, named after his grandfather. Well, he went to the Lancastrian Academy, we know that as Lindsley, and went off to Washington College, which is Washington and Jefferson now. When he came home, he settled back on the farm and he married Rebecca Morgan, and they gave us 3 lovely granddaughters. There was Ruth Ann and Elizabeth and Martha. And when Archibald passed away, his wife Rebecca remained at the old homestead with me. Do you know that house was there until 1949? Our second son was Joseph. Now, Joseph went to Princeton, and he became an attorney, and he dedicated his life to public service. He was in the West Virginia Senate and the House, and served 2 terms as Speaker of the House there. Oh, but his political career was cut short. He suffered from Bright's disease and died when he was only 48 years old. Then there was Hamilton. Oh, poor Hamilton. He died at 35. And our 2 daughters, Annie Mae and Martha, both died in their 20s. And George was the last to survive, although he passed away a short time before me. But George took over the farm. And in 1890, he said, "We have to split this farm up. We're going to change it into building plots so that all of these new people will have someplace to live, because Wheeling is just getting so crowded." So that's what we did. We split up our farm. But I told him, if you're going to do that, you have to save me several tracts of land, because we're going to make a park for everybody in our new neighborhood to enjoy. You can still see that park today because it's right across the street from Woodsdale Elementary School. Now we went about naming the streets. And of course, closest to the homestead, we named one Archibald and we named one Hamilton. And then we decided to go with the woods theme, so we started naming all the streets that we had laid out after trees. Edgewood, elm, birch, maple, walnut, hawthorn, beech, locust, linden, laurel, pick a tree. If they were there, we named a street after them. And then the silliest thing that we did was we turned our cow pasture into Forest Hills, which I thought was really funny. But that's how Woodsdale came about. And it's all our fault, and I'm glad. So thank you so much for visiting today, but I'm going to take a nap.
Good afternoon. You know, I heard it through the grapevine that I was going to get some visitors today, and I very much appreciate you breaking the monotony around here. So it's good to see you. My name is Major Thomas H. Norton, retired. Now, I'm not a politician, so I feel a little awkward standing about in front of a group of people talking about myself. So to cure that, I'm going to be reading somewhat with some additional comments from my obituary that appeared on May 13th, 1902, which appeared in the Wheeling Intelligencer the day after my death. I died when I was 68 years old, and as I stand before you now, I'm 183. Probably no death has occurred in many weeks in Wheeling has caused this regret that is expressed on all sides over the demise of Major T.H. Norton that occurred Wednesday night in Wheeling Hospital. The funeral, it was decided last evening, should occur on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock from his late residence at Cecil Place. The Reverend L.W.B. Stryker of St. Matthew's P.E. Church will officiate an interment at Greenwood Cemetery. Now, my home in Cecil Place still exists today. It was built in 1904, and I hear you have something called the internet, and from that I learned it has 5 bedrooms and 3.5 baths on almost a little more than half an acre of land. Now, this internment business, this is what internment looks like. This is my grave. Major Thomas H. Norton was a veteran of the Civil War. Really? Prominent in business and private life, and known and respected by a wide circle of friends. He was born in Norristown, PA, April 29th, 1840, and was the son of George W. and Rachel Norton. Now, George, his father, and his uncles were in the mill business, the predecessors of making nails here in Wheeling, predecessors of the Lavelle nail mill. His early years were spent in Philadelphia, and he came to Wheeling to pursue his early education. Now, that institution of education still exists today. Lindsley, graduate of 1858. At 18, I was good with my sums there at Lindsley. I became the pay clerk at the Belmont Iron Works. And in 1859, I entered the Virginia militia. There was no West Virginia back then. As an uncommissioned officer, and I was there on duty at the execution of John Brown. When President Lincoln called for volunteers, Corporal Norton organized a company of millmen and was elected second lieutenant. Well, they don't do that anymore. The soldiers don't get to elect their officers, but back then that was a thing. Right? Especially at the state militia level. Not regular army yet, as your state militia, until you're mustered into the regular army. He was mustered in by Major James Oker. He distinguished himself in war and rose step by step in service until he was commissioned by President Lincoln as a major, and then he retired. After retiring, he came to Wheeling, was engaged in the banking and brokerage businesses, and he maintained his offices in the City Bank building. Now in 1872, a man of 32 years old, retired major from the Army, married Nanny Wheeler of Hammondsport, New York. They had no issue, and she died in 1880. 2 years later, Nellie Wheeler, his deceased wife's sister, became his second wife. Hello, love. This is Nellie. They did have an issue. Thomas Wheeler Norton, their only son. Now, my first engagement in the Civil War was in a little town called Philippi, Virginia. Distinguished as not only having a covered bridge, but being the first land action of the Civil War. And it was for the service I performed there during that skirmish, hard to call it a battle, that I was advanced from second lieutenant to captain. The next couple years, 61 through 62, I was stationed in Columbus trying to drum up recruits for the Union cause. I got into fighting action down in Memphis and Missionary Ridge and was there for all of the battles that constituted the Atlanta campaign under General Sherman. When the war finally ended in April of 1865, I chose to stay on and was stationed in the Reconstruction South, serving in Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. You know, the Reconstruction was that period of time where we didn't quite trust all of those Confederates. And so we kind of, we had military officers in control of their state and local governments to make sure they were complying with the Reconstruction laws and pledging their alliance to the now Union. It was during those Reconstruction years in 1868 and 1869 that I actually, as a military officer, served as the president of Jackson, Mississippi. The following December of 1870, I'm remiss in not telling you something I'm very proud of. During the Atlanta campaign, I was promoted from a captain to a brevet major. Brevet? Did he say that right? You know what a brevet is? Huh? Well, very close. A brevet is an award for an award for meritorious service. Often, you know, you might think of a battlefield promotion. So he was given the honor of using the title of major, but they still paid him as a captain. it taketh, giveth away. And I was honored to receive the Medal of Honor from the West Virginia legislature. I am a proud veteran. As I said, I came back to Wheeling to pursue my life, my banking and brokerage career. Started my family. I also had investment interests in mining in the states of Colorado and Oregon. You know, as much as I enjoyed having you here to talk to me, as an 83-year-old man, I tire easily. Thank you for coming. Would you come visit me again?
Hi, I'm so happy you've come by for a visit. My name is Helen Tolman, and my final resting place is here, in this beautiful mausoleum. My parents are here too, and around us are many of our ancestors. You may have heard of my great-grandfather, Dr. John Oaf. You'll meet him later today. There's a street right here in Wheeling named for the family. He was born in Shepherdstown, which was then in Virginia back in 1788. He practiced medicine in Charleston for a while, and then moved to Wheeling in about 1817. He inherited a great deal of land in the area from his father, who was also named John. He and my great-grandmother, Helen Coyer Oaf, had 10 children. Can you imagine keeping track of all of those kids? My grandmother, Helen Karina Oaf, was their 8th child, one of 6 daughters. My grandmother married Parker John Gilchrist. I never knew my grandmother. She died before I was born. But Grandfather John lived until I was 7 years old. At the young age of 39 years old, he became president of the Wheeling Iron and Nail Works. Later, he served as a member of the board of directors of that company. My mother, Caroline Gilchrist, was one of the 7 children in that family. My father was Albert P. Tallman. Daddy was a banker. He was the president of the First National Bank of Blair, Ohio. I suppose I'll always think of him as Daddy. You see, he died when I was only 5 years old. Then there was just Mother and me, since I was an only child. Fortunately, we could afford to remain living in our home in Leatherwood, along with several live-in servants. And we had quite an extended family, so our lives were full. And you see many of those family members around us now, Oafs and Gilchrists and Tallmans. I must admit, though, most of these relatives were older than I was. You see, I didn't get to live to an old age. I died of tuberculosis when I was only 20 years old. You've probably heard of tuberculosis, or TB as it's sometimes called. It was also in the past called consumption. It's a disease of the lungs caused by a bacterium. During my time, it was fairly common for poor people who lived in crowded conditions and didn't get proper nutrition. And anyone of any age could get it. Those infected cough a lot and lose weight. It spread from one person to another when people with TB cough, spit, sing, sneeze, or even just speak. But don't worry, you won't catch it from me. I'm no longer contagious. Since my family was well off, I was sent to a famous tuberculosis sanatorium in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, hoping to be cured. The facility had been founded years before by Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau. He had watched his older brother die of tuberculosis, and then he himself was diagnosed with it. The story is that he was carried to the Adirondacks to spend the last few days of his life there. But instead of dying, he immediately began to regain his strength, probably due to the fresh air and sunshine. He actually lived another 43 years and devoted the rest of his life to seeking a cure for tuberculosis and treating patients. Within just a few years, several large houses were built on Lake Saranac. They were called cure cottages. Among the patients was the famous author Robert Louis Stevenson. Dr. Trudeau died before I went to Saranac, but his legacy lived on. All of us received the best care that money could buy. Good food, plenty of fresh air, and comfortable daybeds and reclining chairs. There were nearly 6,000 people at the facility in 1919, my final year there. They came from all over the world, and there were different cottages for different groups of people. Why, I can remember a Greek cottage and a Cuban cottage, and even a cottage for circus workers. And there were so many young men there who contracted tuberculosis after being exposed to mustard gas in the Great War. How sad. You may know that years later, tuberculosis could be detected by chest x-rays, and some very smart scientists developed antibiotics to effectively treat it. But unfortunately, that was long after my time. Well, I know you need to move along, but I do appreciate your visit, and I hope you'll stop by again to say hello.
Well, hello. I didn't hear you approach. I'm so involved mixing up my remedies and my prescriptions here, involved with my work. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. John Oaf, and my father, he had the same name. His name was John Oaf, and he was credited with a lot of patriotic services during the Revolutionary War. And if you'll notice over here at his gravesite, he has a flag and a medallion representing his patriotic service during this Revolutionary War. My mother, her name was Susanna Shepherd. She was the daughter of David Shepherd and the brother of Moses. And you may have heard of Moses Shepherd. He has a stone mansion out there, and I think you call that Elm Grove today. And he has a mansion out there. So that was my mother's brother Moses. So my family came to this area. My father was a farmer, and my family came to this area when I was just a small child, and we moved to the Wheeling area. And but I went on to college and went over to Jefferson College, and I got my medical degree from there, and I started my very first practice down in Charleston, West Virginia. Eventually I moved it up here to Wheeling, and I was the very first trained doctor, physician here in the Wheeling area. And I don't mean to brag or anything, but I did have a very good reputation, and I was known for formulating my various remedies and various prescriptions, and I had quite an extensive practice at that time. But I had a son, and his name was John Q. Oaf. And John was also a trained physician, and he and I became members of the very first medical society here in Wheeling, and that was in 1835. And one of the first things we did was to set patient fees. Back in the day, the fee was $1 to $2 for your first visit, or $0.50 to $1 for your second. I think those rates have gone up a little bit since my time. But you know, I practiced medicine until I was 52 years old. And at that time, I decided to pursue some of my other interests. And one of those was fish. I captured, along the Ohio River and its tributaries, black bass. And I sent those black bass over to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and they used those black bass to stock the Potomac River. Now, I wonder if those fish in the Potomac are any descendants of my fish that I'd sent over there to Washington, D.C. One of the other things that I had an interest in is in building things. I built warehouses, and I built mills and tenements, and I actually even built a theater. We also built a couple concrete homes in the Wheeling area, and at that time most homes were built of log and frame structure, and these concrete homes were much, much stronger. And I tell you, my neighbors, you know what they know I was known for was all my vast orchards. You see, I believed in the health benefits of eating fruit. And so I had vast orchards, and I let all the children in the neighborhood and everything gather the fruit from the ground. And I know all that fruit didn't fall naturally to the ground, but you know, I never complained since there was a lot of health benefits to eating fruit. Now, my wife, Helen Courier, was very involved with the church and church affairs. I donated the land and built the very first St. John's Episcopal Church in Wheeling. My son Beverly followed in his mother's footsteps. He was the church organist and the church choir director. And we had clergy from the Virginia area, and bishops and clergy and prominent citizens coming and going from our home at all different times. But I understand the Civil War came after my demise, and there was much dissension at that church. And at times they even called that church Oaf's Chapel. But that church was torn down, and another stone church built not too far from that same location. And I'm quite pleased that there's a stained glass window in that church today that has my name on it, Dr. John Oaf, and I'm quite pleased with that. Well, my wife and I, we lived quite a lengthy life compared to most people at that time. I lived to the age of 71, and my wife joined me at the age of 85. Well, I thank you for letting me share my story. Now remember, there's health benefits to eating your fruit, so don't forget to eat your fruit.
Welcome. My name is Henrietta R. Benz Romine Folks, and I was laid to rest right there by that unassuming gravestone with the white flower. As you can see from my sash, I was very involved in the women's suffrage movement. Until 1920, women did not have the right to vote in the United States. It seems hard to believe now, but there were many women in Wheeling and around the country that worked hard to make that change. Let me back up a bit. I was born right here in Wheeling, the daughter of Henry and Lily Arbenz. Father was a professor of music at the Wheeling Conservatory of Music, so I became a musician myself and served as the chairwoman of the music program for the Wheeling Women's Club. I also worked closely with Eleanor Caldwell in the mid-1920s when she founded the Wheeling Symphony. And later, I helped popularize the summer concerts at Ogilby by distributing announcements to local merchants. We didn't advertise by Facebook those days. But my real passion was voting rights for women. I married Edward Romine in 1910 when I was 20 years old. Edward was a widower and a real estate investor and investment broker. And it was as Mrs. Romine that I began my suffragist efforts. In 1915, I began by selling suffragist newspapers on Chaplin Street in Wheeling. Then I took auto trips up the river to the steel mills, where I handed out flyers to the men as they finished their shifts and left for home. I will say that the men were always very courteous to us, perhaps because we were well dressed and were driven by George Laughlin's chauffeur. 9 of us even made it on the front page of the Wheeling Intelligencer. We also brought in out-of-town speakers to support our efforts. I can remember one very effective speaker who talked from the back of a car with an open top right here in Wheeling on 14th Street, just across the street from the Hub department store. I think that's where your West Banco Bank building is today. An enormous crowd gathered, mostly men, and they listened spellbound. I can't really say that I was much of a public speaker, but I was very good at soliciting letters and telegrams when they needed it for the support to their efforts. The women who were antis, they set up headquarters at the corner of Market and 14th Street and ran up a banner that said, "A woman's place is in the home." So we set up an office next door with our own banner that proclaimed, "If the home is women's sphere, what are the antis doing here?" Finally, a federal amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the 19th Amendment, passed Congress in 1919, granting women the right to vote. But before it could become law, 3/4 of the states also had to ratify that amendment. In February 1920, West Virginia Governor John Cornwall called a special session of the legislature to address the 19th Amendment issue. The House approved the resolution to ratify the amendment by a vote of 47 to 40. Then it had to go to the state Senate. And there it was caught in a tie, 14-14. What to do? Well, we knew that State Senator Jesse Block was in favor of this ratification, but he was on vacation in California, nearly 3,000 miles away. Well, I stepped right in to help. Senator Block got on a train from the West Coast due to arrive in Charleston at 2 a.m. I offered to personally meet his train to escort him to the hotel, but that offer was turned down as being very undignified. A young woman such as myself could not be seen in the middle of the night meeting a man at a train station. So I found another way to help. Several other legislators were tired and they were ready to leave before the vote was cast again. I had a list of those men and I kept track of them. One was actually walking to meet his own train home, suitcase in hand. I convinced him to return. Another one, a carpenter, had returned to work and was on some scaffolding. I climbed that ladder and I made sure he returned. The rest is history. Senator Block arrived in time to cast his vote, and on March 10, 1920, West Virginia became the 34th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Only 2 more states were needed to make women's suffrage a federal law, and those 2 states ratified in August, just in time for some 26 million women to cast their first vote in the 1920 presidential election. I later became a charter member of the West Virginia League of Women Voters and became its second president, the youngest state president in the country. And so my work continued. After my husband, Edward Romine, died, I later married George Folks and lived to the ripe old age of 95. Many of you were alive then, because I died in 1985. So ladies, please don't take your right to vote for granted. Many of us worked very hard to make that happen. I hope you remember me this next election day. Thank you, baby.
My name is Edith Lake Wilkinson. I was born in Wheeling in 1868. My father was James Wilkinson, and he was a paymaster, accountant, and veteran of the Civil War. My mother was Edith Lake Wilkinson, and she was an artist. She was also an art teacher and came from Edinburgh, Scotland. I had a sister by the name of Jane, and she was born in 1875. I left Wheeling in 1888 to pursue my career as an artist, and I attended the Art Students League in New York, where I learned a great deal about creating block prints, charcoals, and paintings. I loved what I learned, but I decided to go to Columbia University, where I majored in fine arts. While I was in New York, I met a woman that was 13 years older than I by the name of Fanny Wilkinson, no relation to me. And Fanny and I just hit it right off, even though she was 13 years older than I. We just had a great time. We traveled to Europe numerous times to look at the masters and the work of all the famous artists over there. And we lived together for 20 years. It was wonderful. Well, in 1907, we had some real tragedy in our family. My sister Jane died a year after she gave birth to her only son, Edward. It was so sad. My aunt moved up from Fraser, West Virginia to take care of my nephew and was with him until he graduated from college. My aunt, while she lived here in Wheeling, would go over to visit my parents who lived on Zane Street on Wheeling Island. And one day when she went over, there was Mother sitting in the chair with her paper folded in her lap and looked like she was asleep. And then she looked further and there was my father lying on the floor, barely breathing. And she called the emergency people when they came, but he died on the way to the hospital. You see, he died because of a faulty ventilated pipe, and they died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Well, that left me in charge of their estate. So a very prominent attorney here in Wheeling was hired to take care of all the financial things dealing with that estate. And his name was George Jackson Rogers. Well, he gave me a modest income. He was highly thought of in this community. He was just socially involved. He had a big home, he had fancy cars, and he was a Harvard graduate. Well, little did I know that yes, he was giving me an income, but he was also embezzling all of my money. Well, in 1934, he admitted me to Shepherd Pratt Institute, which was a mental institution in Baltimore, Maryland. Very prominent. As far as the institution was well thought of, it was very progressive. And I would walk the grounds and I would paint, and it was actually, for a mental institution, very pleasant. I was admitted, however, saying that I was paranoid. I was not paranoid. I had no indication of a mental breakdown. I had nothing in my paintings, in my work, in my demeanor that indicated that I had any kind of a mental issue. But at that time, women were being admitted just for sitting incorrectly. So I was admitted and stayed there for 10 years. While I was there, Zelda Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, was also there. She was crazy. There was no doubt about it. The woman had mental issues. But I liked her. Well, then I received a letter from George Rogers that said my money had run out and that I could no longer stay there. In the meantime, my partner, Fanny, had moved south, left our apartment because she was very sad living alone. And so she moved in with her parents, and then she died. Well, no one told me she died. My best friend, my partner, I never knew that she had passed away. But anyway, George Rogers put all of my belongings in a trunk and sent them to Wheeling, West Virginia, to a home on Hawthorne Court that belonged to a relative by the name of Betty Vossler. She put the trunk in the attic, and it remained there for 40 years. I then, because my nephew, George Rogers' brother-in-law, sued him because not only was he stealing from me, he was stealing from his own family and 9 other families in Wheeling. So he was stripped of his law degree. He ended up, there's going to be a story, you're going to hear it from Clara Rogers. And do listen to her story because it's what happened after he was in big trouble. Anyway, there was no money. My nephew couldn't take care of me. I was having some mental problems at that point. He had to put me in Huntington State Hospital. Horrible place, horrible. It was a facility that was built for 500. There were 1,500 people. It had one psychiatric physician, psychiatrist that was in charge of 500 people. One nurse in the whole facility. They served our food cold. We were served meat twice a month in either a stew or cream chip beef. The state allotted $1 per patient, and 36 cents of that, 37 cents of that was allotted for food. I remained there for the rest of my life. I never painted again. I had a physician that wrote this last report on me. It said, Edith makes her own bed. She talks to herself. She imagines everything. She's deteriorating mentally, but is fine physically, very thin. At times, she's combative. And I wonder, wouldn't we all be if we had to live like that? I died at the age of 89. I was admitted when I was 57. I died in 1957. Now I'll tell you the rest of the story. Jane Anderson, who is an Emmy Award-winning artist, producer, and a writer, came to Wheeling to do a documentary. She grew up with Edith's paintings because of her mother. And so she didn't want Edith to be forgotten. So she came here and she, with her team, produced a documentary called Packed in a Trunk, Revisit, I'm telling you about my book, Packed in a Trunk, The Lost Art of Edith Blake Wilkinson. And you can Google that. It was on HBO a while, it's not now. But it's a wonderful documentary about her life. This is an example of Edith's work. You'll notice that the child has no face. Edith believed that you can imagine what that child's face looked like, so you become involved in the painting. She did a lot of different types of painting. This is very colorful. Some of her painting is very, very muted. Her block prints are wonderful, as well as her charcoals. Now, another interesting fact is when Jane's mother came to Wheeling to visit her sister-in-law, they said, let's go up in the attic and look in the trunk. So they did. They opened the trunk, and there was pictures, some paintings that Edith had done. Jane then asked if she could take them back to Provincetown, where Edith took a lot of time there, and she belonged to a league there. So they were going to have a museum and feature Edith's work, which was great. But Betty said, oh, you know, a couple years ago, my church was having a rummage sale, and I came up and got a lot of pictures out of the trunk and gave them to my church rummage sale here in Wheeling. So Jane is convinced, Jane Anderson, that there are more of Edith's paintings here locally. One was found in Huntington. If you ever see anything, and you can look at her different work, rarely signed, please let me know, because Jane Anderson would love to know where her great aunt's pictures are. And also, Edith, which was good news, was just inducted into the Wheeling Hall of Fame this year. She will not be forgotten. Thank you very much.
Well, folks, good afternoon, and the change of seasons is upon us. Remember yesterday? We shall see what tomorrow brings. My name is Hanson Elbridge Waddell. My friends and family call me Hans, and you may do so also. I was born in Wheeling on April 3rd, 1846. My father was Elijah Waddell, who was a farmer. He also read law, and he served as a justice of the peace for Ohio County. And my mother was Beth Ann Boggs. In the early 1850s, our family, along with my father's brothers, 3 brothers' families, relocated from this area to southern Illinois, Christian County, a little town called Taylorville. They were attracted to that area because of the rich farmland and at low cost. And unfortunately, not too long after my family got settled there, my father fell ill and passed away. So my mother brought my 2 sisters, my brother and me, back to Wheeling, and we lived with my grandfather Boggs on his farm in Triadelphia. At about that time, I enrolled at West Liberty Academy for my elementary school education, and then I moved on for my secondary schooling to West Alexander Academy. This was the period of the Civil War. My uncle, William Boggs, was the colonel of the volunteer militia in Triadelphia that was charged with guarding the safety of the B&O rail lines, which of course was transporting troops and ammunition during the war. And in the last year of the war, I was 18 years old, my uncle appointed me his aide-de-camp, which meant every time the alarm went up, I'd have to leap on my horse and make a dash for Wheeling to get it to his office in order to help make sure everything was in order for whatever operations he wanted to proceed with. It was exciting, challenging, and we were all quite relieved when it was over. Following the war, I had my mind set to enter the business as a line of work. And I enrolled toward that end at the Iron City Commercial College in Pittsburgh, which turns out to be the first business school in the country. And when I completed my studies, I came back to Wheeling and I worked for Mr. A. Sheets, who owned and operated a dry goods store on Water Street in Wheeling. I was his bookkeeper and a salesperson. Mr. Sheets decided to take the business across the river to Bel Air, Ohio, where 2 very fortuitous events occurred for me. First of all, I became exposed to the glass industry. At that time, there were 6 glassworks operating in Bel Air. It was called the Glass City. And I was very intrigued by this line of industrial work as an opportunity possibly for me. The second event was I met my wife, Emma Virginia Hoover, and we were married June 1st, 1871. And in the course of time, we had 3 sons and a daughter. I got my opportunity to enter the glass business when the National Glass Company in Bel Air asked me to join them as their corporate secretary and sales manager, which I did. Now, at that period of time, the glass industry was very dynamic. There were new glassworks springing up, there were existing glassworks that were merging, and there were glassworks that unfortunately failed. I think I worked for most of all of them on both sides of the river. I also had worked for Rotifer Brothers, I worked for McKee Glass, I worked for Heisey Glass, I worked for Central Glass. I also worked for Hobbs Glass. I was hired at Hobbs Glass to be the corporate secretary and the superintendent of Plant H, which was the wheeling works at 36th, 37th Streets in South Wheeling. And during that period of time, I designed a pattern of glass and its decoration, which I patented. And it was produced by Hobbs, and it was quite popular. I'm going to take the liberty of reading you a little excerpt from the Pottery and Glass Reporter of December 5th, 1889, about this pattern of glass. As follows. Recently, Hobbs Glass brought a brand new celery called the Autumn Celery, which has been selling like wildfire. In fact, the works is kept hustling to make enough of them. It is one of the greatest selling articles in the market. It sells on sight. These celeries are made in the shape of a leaf in flint clear glass with a gold stain, and they are as pretty as can be. The number is 334, and this line will also be made in other tableware such as olives, pickles, bowls, etc. Now, do you know what I'm talking about, a celery? Really? I'm sure you do. There are two kinds of celeries, but let me talk first about celery. Celery in the 19th century was not grown domestically. It had to be imported from South America. So it was expensive, and it was a status symbol to have it on your table. If you were going to give a fancy party, you had celery if you could do it. So there were vertical celeries, which is what this is describing, and there were also horizontal celeries. The vertical celeries were partly filled with water, and you would put the celery stalks in with the leaves, which was pretty. In that period of time, there was a dish for everything. It was a very opulent and extravagant period of time in terms of presentation, enhanced by candlelight, and it made for a beautiful setting. I have a piece of this crystallina with me. This is a sauce dish. Now this piece I know was made by the U.S. Glass Company in Chicago. They bought the molds from Hobbs. There's more on that I will say in a bit. But this is the amber they're talking about. And the reason I know it's U.S. glass is because it's a solid color. The pieces produced by Hobbs were clear, and only the rim was amber. Amber is achieved by adding silver nitrate to what they call the recipe for the glass to create the color. So everything was rolling along very nicely at Hobbs Glass until October 24th, 1890, when we had a terrible fire in the factory. And as the superintendent, I was called in to help direct the efforts to save the building and equipment and materials. In spite of the fact that we lost $20,000 to $25,000 worth of equipment and material, which in today's dollars is $800,000. We were up and running again in 3 days' time, and the employees were so grateful that they presented me with a gold-handled walking stick that had the description of an inscription of gratitude engraved in it. It looked very special to me. Now, in the late 1890s, the glass industry was falling on hard times. Mechanization had come to the glass industry, and it was very difficult for the glass being made by people to compete with mass production of mechanized industry. So the U.S. Glass Company that made this piece began to absorb the other companies like Hobbs that were unable to maintain an independent business presence. So I was invited by the U.S. Glass Company to move to Chicago and join their executive team, which I did. And I was there until 1910, when my wife and I returned to Wheeling in retirement. And I had a wonderful, a very rich retirement in the sense that I was involved with the Presbyterian Church, I was a member of the Odd Fellows, I was a member of the Freemasons, I was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. I had the delightful adventure of teaching some of my grandchildren to read before they went to school. But all good things must come to an end, and I passed away September 11th, 1927. The white flower down here marks my resting place. And of interest is that the year before me, Colonel Olaby died. And he left his farm, as I understand it, to the city, and it's now a park. Well, in that park is a glass museum. And in that glass museum, right now, is a display of crystalline glass made by Hobbs, so it would be the clear version with the trim, in different colors, by the way, and of all kinds of shapes and sizes. And also on display is my gold-handled walking stick. So if you'd like to see more of this, and decide for yourselves whether you prefer the solid color or the clear with the trim, you be the maker of the decision. Thank you for coming today.
I was just looking at some newspaper ads for different department stores. My name's Jacob Thomas, and you may recognize that name from Stone Thomas Department Store. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. Now, I was born in 1822. I was not born in West Virginia. I was born in Ohio, in Belmont County. My father was an immigrant from Wales, and when he arrived in the United States, he bought a small farm that we farmed until I was at the age of 24. When I was around 24 years old, my sister Elizabeth met a gentleman by the name of Eli Stone. And Eli and my sister moved to Wheeling, where they decided they were going to open up a small dry goods business. Now, I came to visit them, and I really liked the excitement in Wheeling. I just liked the hustle and the bustle of it, and I wanted to be a part of this. So I convinced my sister and her husband to let me be partners in this business. And so we opened up a small dry goods store. Now, this small dry goods store was a high-end store. So we had things like china, we had things like silk, we had things like tweed, we had things like cashmere. The problem with our store that we picked that we thought would be really great is there was no lighting, and it was very dark in there, and no one could see any of our fine goods. Now, our goods came from all over the country, including outside the country. So what we decided to do was to move. We moved across the street to 10th and Main Street. Now, you should recognize it because that's where the Stone & Thomas is today, but at that time there was just a very small store there called the Beehive. And it was a very popular store, and it was very modern, but eventually we purchased it, switched the name from the Beehive, and that's where Stone & Thomas Department Store was born. We became super successful. Now, those of you who remember Stone & Thomas should remember that when you got the newspaper, you open it up and you would find ads from Stone & Thomas, entire pages full. And that proved successful for us. We grew, and every time we grew, we would expand. We would add more items. We would add different things to attract new customers. And pretty soon, we had pretty much the entire 10th block of Main Street in downtown Wheeling. Now, the problem is I became, my brother-in-law became very, very sick. He became bedridden. Now, he did have 10 children, and so he was able to pass on his share of the department store to his children. But I, on the other hand, never married and never had any children. And so there wasn't anyone for me to really pass this on to. He passed it on to 2 of his children. One was named Wilbur, and the other one just called him E.L. They ran the store for him. But we got larger, we expanded. The problem was I was getting older, and I wanted to retire. Now, I don't want you to laugh at this, but I wanted to retire to Wheeling Island. My sister lived on Wheeling Island, a lot of prominent people lived on Wheeling Island, and so I just wanted to live on Wheeling Island. Then I would walk over to the store about midday where I'd spend a few hours inside the store. But besides running the store, I also invested money really, really well. I had 4 businesses. I had 4 farms, 1 in Belmont County. I had 3 out on Short Creek. So I amassed a fortune at that time of around $760,000. Now, I know you folks are thinking, that doesn't sound like very much money. But on today's standards, it would be around $25 million. The problem is I had no heirs, no wife, no children. And I didn't want people to forget me because I had done a lot of good things. So I had my executor of my estate, who happened to be my nephew, Wilbur. He, in the will, I wanted them to spend about $15,000 on my monument. So $15,000, this is what he built for me. Now, in today's, that would be about $500,000. But I always get this question, who are these women? Any guesses? Most likely, since we're all adults here, most likely his mistresses. He never married, but did enjoy the company of women. Because we know this because when he died, he left very little bit of his money to his family. He left a large percentage of his money to a few great places in Wheeling. The Children's Home of Wheeling got a percentage of it. The St. Vincent's got a percentage of it. And a society called the Friendless Women Society got a large percentage of that money for him. Now, the Friendless Women Society is where all of these people had servants, right? And they didn't marry, right? These women didn't marry, and so there was no Social Security. So once they couldn't work anymore, where would they go? And then Altenheim was opened, and so a large percentage of money was sent to them so that they could support these women. But Stone & Thomas grew. At the end, before Stone & Thomas is sold, because it stays in the family from 1847 all the way until 1998 when it's sold to Elder Bierman. So it's sold to Elder Bierman for around $32 million. They have 21 different stores, and a few are sold out to Belk's, but eventually Elder Bierman files bankruptcy too, and that's really the end of the whole company. Although I will say you can still see some of these folks. Bill was the last one to run the company, who was part of the family. He still lives in Wheeling, and you can see him around here.
Thanks so much for coming. I'm sure most of you are visitors, but we'll take walk-ins later. I'm not going anywhere, so if you need something done. My name's Dr. John Frisell. I was a physician in Wheeling. Now, I was born in 1810 in Massachusetts, the western part of Massachusetts. My dad was a Scottish farmer, and my mom, Wilcox, believed in education, and for my 3 brothers and myself and my sisters believed in education, but mostly for the males in the family at that time. Now, at that time, you made a decision pretty early what you wanted to pursue. And I first went to Williams College, which was in Massachusetts, graduating in 1831. Now, I then started a medical career, but while I was at Williams College, I also worked with a Dr. Emmons, and I was an assistant to him, which meant I assisted him in surgeries and other procedures that he would do, and is working in his office. And I, after graduating from Williams College, then started my medical career and worked with Dr. Parker in Massachusetts. Now, at that time, I became Dr. Parker's demonstrator. And what that meant was I would do all the dissections and that kind of work for Dr. Parker, and in education, then he would use my dissections to teach other physicians and other students. So I became pretty proficient in anatomy and surgery. Now, at the same time, I was able to attend lectures. So in 1835, I received my medical degree. Now, I stayed on for a year and worked with Dr. Parker as his demonstrator. But then in 1836, I came to Wheeling, and that just happened to be the year that Wheeling became a city. Now, it was still Wheeling, Virginia at the time, but later to become Wheeling, West Virginia. So I came to Wheeling, and initially I lived on 14th Street. I started on 14th Street, and there on 14th Street, next to my home, I opened a small clinic. Now, my practice was pretty slow in the beginning, so I studied botany and I studied geology of the area, and I would do lectures to students and to classes in the area on those 2 topics. Now my practice continued to grow, and I stayed in the clinic on 14th Street. Now, while I was in Wheeling, I met my wife Elizabeth, who was from Moundsville, and we married and lived on 14th Street. Now we had 3 sons. My one son, John, died at an early age of typhoid, and despite all my expertise and my colleagues, we could not save him. Now he's laid to rest next to me up on the hill, second large pine tree between those 2 spires. Over here there's a darker stone with a white ribbon on the top of it, just next to that one spire behind it, up on the hill. Now he laid to rest there with me. Now I did have a son, Charles, who became a physician. He stayed to practice in Wheeling, and he was instrumental in beginning the nursing school at Wheeling Hospital in 1900. But we continued to live on 14th Street. Now as I got busier, I did look for help, and I worked with Dr. Houlihan. Dr. Houlihan became very instrumental in starting Wheeling Hospital as well. Now, Dr. Houlihan was a very accomplished oral surgeon, so we did a lot of procedures. Now, I was the first physician in West Virginia to use chloroform as an anesthetic, and I was also the first physician in West Virginia to repair club feet with the help of a colleague from Philadelphia. Now, Dr. Houlihan and I worked together for several years. We had an infirmary on 15th Street. And in 1850, the bishop became the Wheeling Diocese. Bishop Whalen commissioned the first Wheeling Hospital, and he recruited Dr. Houlihan and myself to be chief surgeons. Now, Dr. Houlihan only lived to 46. He died of pneumonia. So we did work together just a short period of time. But then we continued to get busier, and after Dr. Houlihan passed away, I became the chief surgeon, and I was there for 20 years at Wheeling Hospital as the chief surgeon. Now, shortly after the hospital was founded on 15th Street, it became quite busy, and when the Sisters of St. Joseph arrived in Wheeling, it was busy enough. They worked together with us, and eventually the hospital was built in North Wheeling, and it became the large Wheeling Hospital. Now Wheeling, during that time, became quite busy as a general hospital. Now then an unpleasantry happened several years later called the Civil War. And Wheeling was pretty strategic within this area as far as the Civil War. We were on the B&O Railroad, you were on the river, and plus we're the only hospital between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. So it's a pretty strategic area. Now, during the Civil War, Governor Pierpont appointed me the medical superintendent for this area, which meant I was in charge of supervising the care of Confederate prisoners, Union soldiers that were being brought here to be treated. I was also appointed to the medical board, which means I was responsible for certifying any physicians or surgeons that were going to work in the area and work in West Virginia. So it became pretty busy. Now there was a prisoner camp at the prison at the end of, or South Wheeling, in South Wheeling during that time, and we treated the prisoners from there as well. And I recall one day during the Civil War when over 200 injured soldiers or prisoners were brought to Wheeling to be treated. So we became pretty busy at that time. And then after the Civil War in 1865, the West Virginia State Medical Association was formed, and I became its first president. I passed away in 1893 of typhoid, similar to my son, and I'm laid to rest here. So that is my story. I'm available later. I have some chloroform and a couple instruments here. You need something done, I'd be happy to take care of you. Of course, physicians at that time just did about everything. We'd even treat your horse if you came in and your horse and it had a problem. We'd try to fix it as well. So, any questions? I'd be happy to answer questions. This is an actual chair that if you walked into a physician's office in 1850, you'd probably sit in that kind of chair to be treated. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see people walking around the cemetery this afternoon. My name is Clara West Rogers, and my final resting place is behind me here where the flower is. My husband is right next to me. His name was George Rogers. Now, George and I both came from very prominent families. George's father, for example, began his career as a principal in a private school in Kentucky. And when the Civil War broke out, he wanted to join the Confederate forces. But his mother convinced him not to, and instead he came to Wheeling, studied law, and passed the bar on June 18th, 1863. Now, if your history is good, you'll notice that that was 2 days before West Virginia officially became a state. So George's father then was a prosecuting attorney for a while and eventually was a local judge. My grandfather had a similar job sequence. He began as a teacher in Ohio, studied law, passed the bar in Ohio, and became a prosecuting attorney. He served in the Ohio legislature and eventually was a judge on the Ohio State Supreme Court. He liked to tell people that his fondest memory was having attended the convention in Chicago when Abraham Lincoln had been nominated as president. So that was my grandfather. My father, John West, was also a lawyer, so I guess it was fate that I would marry a lawyer as well, and I did. George had gone to Lindsley, then the University of Virginia, and got his law degree from Harvard. We were married in 1912, and we had 5 children over the next 10 years. George's initial law practice was primarily in civil law, and he did quite well. And we lived well as a result. We had a 6-bedroom house. Our dining room table could seat 12. In the 1920s, we had 3 cars. We had a Pontiac, a Ford, and a Cadillac. And of course, we had live-in help, a maid and a cook. Then came 1929 and the stock market crash, and then the Depression. George had been managing the estates of several wealthy families in Wheeling, and you may have met one of his clients earlier on the tour, the artist Edith Lake Wilkinson. Yes. So George in 1935 was charged with 10 counts of embezzlement. 1 count had to do with the artist's estate. George was also managing the estate of his widowed mother and his aunt, Margaret Lang. Margaret's grave is right over there as well. As it turned out, George had borrowed from his aunt's estate an amount that in today's money would be about $1.25 million. Oh my goodness, the scandal. This was not a happy time for us. George was arrested. He was released on bail, $10,000 bail, which was a lot of money at that time. Fortunately, he did not have to go to prison, but he lost his law license and had to try to pay back what he could. Well, we lost the house, we lost the cars, the furniture was auctioned off. 2 of our kids had made it through college already, but the other 3 hadn't, and fortunately we had friends and relatives who would help them finish their education, which they did. But what about work? Well, of course, we had downsized. We didn't have the expenses that we had before. We lived in a 2nd-story apartment on Elm Street in Woodsdale. George got a variety of little jobs, such as driving a delivery truck for a dry cleaner. But what about me? Now here I am, I'm in my late 40s. I had a college education. I had graduated from Worcester College. I had some experience in the community. I had been one of the founders of Wheeling Country Day School, for example. But I'd never worked outside the home. Never really worked inside the home. So what could I do? Well, I got a job as a house mother in a girls' dormitory at West Liberty State College. And I worked my way up to the point where I was the Dean of Women. And I held that position for a long number of years until I finally retired at age 65 in 1952. And do you know that a few years later they built a new girls' dormitory and they named it Rogers Hall in my honor. So what can we learn from this? I think we need to learn from our past. And you know, if we had not had that catastrophe in my life, I never would have been in a position as a Dean of Women. And I must have had a positive influence. I must have been a good role model for those young ladies, or they never would have named a dorm after me. And that never would have happened if I hadn't had to go to work. So when we think about our own lives, we'll all have something bad happen. And it's a matter of our character as to what we do to face that kind of adversity.
All right, thank you.